Hello, everyone, and a very warm welcome to Link Online webinar. We would like to apologize for the tech issue happened for today's session, and we will make sure we just record the session. And this is what we are doing today, and we'll be sending to everyone online by email. And please feel free to ask your questions through the email to Adrian Sheridan. And we will ensure we ask all of the questions as soon as possible. Thank you very much. Once again, I introduce myself. My name is Mona Mukhtari, Principal Government Advisor and in the commercial team at Monarchy Fenua Land Care Research Group under the BSI. And welcome you to the Link Online webinar today. Today's session is a typology of practice change on farms. And our presenter is Dr. Jeff Kane. He's a senior economist researcher, and I will hand it over to him shortly. And because we have no Q&A questions function here, and so we will be answering all of the questions through the email later on. Thank you very much, and we will be in touch. Here you go.
Thanks, Mona. I'll just share my screen. Can you see that okay, Mona?
Yes, that's perfect.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone, and thank you for your patience and for joining this recording of our webinar on the results of our research into practice change on farms. The research is part of an MB Endeavour program called Moving the Middle, and the aim of the program is to find ways to help landholders adopt practices that will benefit the environment. The program has 5 themes: systems, interventions, finance, agents of change, and narratives. Our research into types of practice change is part of the systems theme, which involves Suze Valence and myself from the Monarchy Fenua Land Care Group in the BSI, Yori Nook from Lincoln, and Vic Wright from the University of New England. Okay. The purpose of our research into practice change was to explain why a technology or practice might be relatively easy for some farmers to adopt, but difficult, perhaps impossible, for others. Knowing why this is the case is vital if we are to identify what kinds of interventions are needed to help farmers change their practices. Consequently, we wanted to develop a way of classifying changing farm practices according to the difficulty of the change. Our starting point was to recognise that farms are managed open systems and that the components and relationships between components in those systems create constraints on what is feasible to change and how easily change can be made. Since farms are open managed systems, they have some important characteristics when it comes to changing practices and technologies. Some of these are that a farm system uses a set of technologies and practices to produce a set of outputs from a set of inputs. An input is critical if limiting the supply of it puts the purpose of the farm, the viability of the farm business, the objectives of the farmer at risk. There are 2 types of change we can consider regarding inputs. Tactical change is changing the farm structure to adapt to a change in the availability of a critical input. Tactical change involves altering the timing of the use of the critical input by substituting other inputs for the critical input, finding new sources of the critical input, and by reducing the use of the input. Strategic change is changing farm structure to produce a new output in response to a change in the availability of a critical input. The complexity of a change depends on the degree to which the components and the relationships between them in a farm system must be modified to integrate the new technology or practice into the farm system. So when we're thinking about complexity, the complexity of change, rather than thinking about the complexity of the technology or the practice itself, we're thinking about the degree to which the farm system must be adapted, modified, altered, reconfigured in order to accommodate the new practice or technology. We use these characteristics to develop a classification tree that summarizes the difficulty of introducing a new practice or a technology into a farm system. The first step in the tree is to determine if adopting a new practice will restrict access to a critical input. If it doesn't, then the difficulty of adopting the practice or the technology depends simply on its complexity. So in this, what we are thinking of here is that if the answer to the first question at the top of the tree is no, then you're moving down the right-hand side and you ask a second question, which is, does adopting the practice entail complex change? So does adopting the practice or technology entail substantially changing, reconfiguring, adapting, modifying the farm system in order to integrate the practice or technology into the system? On the other hand, if adopting the practice will reduce access to a critical input, then that means that adopting the practice has the potential to threaten the viability of the farm business and the achievement of the farmer's objectives, which means we are on the left-hand side of the tree. For example, fencing off streams may substantially reduce access to pasture, a critical input, therefore reduce production and put the business at risk. This means that to adopt the practice, you need to find a way to reduce your reliance on the critical input. This means you must either find an alternative input, which is tactical change, or switch to a new output that uses less of the critical input, that is, strategic change. For an example of tactical change would be to buy in feed to substitute for the loss of pasture. An example of a strategic change would be shifting to perhaps something like blueberry production where you don't need pasture. Either way, with tactical and strategic change, you need to reconfigure your farm system. We hypothesized that the adoption of a practice would be highest amongst those for whom the change is simple, somewhat less for those for whom the change is complex, and least amongst those for whom the change is tactical or strategic. Now, in the previous example, we were considering a situation where the adoption of a new practice or technology could potentially reduce access to a critical input. The situation changes, however, for a practice that increases access to a critical input. For example, adopting quantitative measurement of pasture cover might lead to a situation where you can increase pasture production and pasture utilisation. If this is the case, then we expect that adoption will be highest amongst those for whom the change is simple or tactical, and lowest amongst those for whom the change is complex or strategic. So our plan was to test these ideas and test these decision trees, typologies, in two ways. To start with, we wanted to interview farmers about a particular practice to see if the same practice entailed different types of change depending on the farm context. So our first test was to interview 30 dairy and dry stock farmers around New Zealand about something that's apparently simple, like fencing off wet areas. We then plan to conduct a number of quantitative surveys to statistically test our ideas. One survey was to investigate practices that are meant to benefit the environment. So we investigated 4 practices: fencing wet areas, fencing streams, planting cover crops, and installing ungrazed laneway buffers on dairy farms. A second survey that we've just recently completed was to look at practices that are related to productivity. So we surveyed about 300 farmers, dairy and dry stock farmers around New Zealand, on virtual fencing, quantitative pasture assessment, keeping non-replacement dairy calves till they're weaned, and growing weaned dairy calves for beef production. And the last survey that we'd like to do, if we have the extra funding for moving the middle, is to do a survey around climate adaptation practices. So our first test was to interview dairy and dry stock farmers about fencing wet areas. This is an example of the classification tree applied to one particular farm. It summarises the results of an interview with a farmer running a large beef sheep property in the King Country on the North Island. They had several wet areas on their property, and what we found was, depending on the location of the wet area, fencing of them could be either simple or complex. If it was simple, they had fenced them. If complex, they had drained the wet areas if it was possible. Otherwise, they left them as they were. The key point here is that the one practice, fencing a wet area, represented different kinds of change on the same farm, just because of slight differences in the context on the farm. So, for example, if fencing wet areas would create pinch points on the property, then that meant that fencing a wet area would require relocating laneways, reconfiguring watering systems, which is a complex change. Whereas if the wet area was not located in a pinch point, then it was relatively simple change to fence the wet area. So this established that the same practice can represent different types of change across different farms, depending on their context, and even within the same farm. Our second test was to survey 331 dairy and dry stock farmers around 4 practices, as I mentioned before: fencing wet areas, fencing streams, planting cover crops after winter grazing, and installing ungrazed laneway buffers. And this slide summarises the results. So on the far right-hand column, we have the proportion of respondents, of the 330 respondents, that had adopted the practice. So roughly speaking, between 50 to the high 60% of respondents had adopted these practices. The columns, the first, second, third, and fourth columns, represent the proportion of those adopting for whom the change was simple, complex, tactical, or strategic. So, for example, in fenced wet areas, 62% of the 67% that had adopted, it was a simple change. For 67% of those that had adopted, it was a complex. 31% of those that adopted the fencing wet areas, it was a complex change. And what you notice here is that around 90% or more of those that had adopted the change, it was a simple or complex change, and roughly the simple change outweighs the complex change in a ratio of 2 to 1. So, as expected, we found that virtually all our responses who had adopted these practices, that the change was simple and or complex, with the majority being simple. In our second survey, we surveyed 273 dairy and dry stock farmers around New Zealand on adopting 4 practices that relate to farm productivity and animal welfare. These were virtual fencing or collaring, quantitative pasture assessment, keeping non-replacement dairy calves on dairy farms till they're weaned, and growing weaned dairy beef calves for beef production. For virtual fencing, growing dairy beef weaners, and keeping non-replacement dairy calves, virtually all the adopters were again those for whom the change was simple or complex. So, for example, of the 23% of farmers that had adopted virtual fencing, nearly 90% of them, 87%, for them, the change was simple. And what you notice is that virtually no one for whom the change was strategic, tactical, or complex had adopted virtual fencing. The same is the case pretty well for growing dairy beef weaners and for keeping non-replacement dairy calves. The exception is for quantitative assessment of pasture cover, and what we get here is that the adopters were split roughly 50-50 between those for whom it was a tactical change and those for whom it was a simple change. This result is consistent with our hypothesis that adoption would be higher amongst those for whom the change is simple or tactical when the practice increases access to a critical input, which is what quantitative pasture assessment does. So some of the implications of these results are that farmers do not change technology or practice because, I'll start again. Farmers often do not adopt a technology or practice because doing so is too complex and the opportunity costs are prohibitive. It's not because they are recalcitrant or they are laggards. Different types of change arise from differences in farm systems, and those differences in the farm systems are not always obvious. We must be careful in assuming early adopters or innovators are in the top 10% of farmers. It may simply be that they have had to make a simple change compared to everyone else. Another implication is that peer-to-peer learning will be more effective among farmers who are facing the same type of change. We believe the typology can help define the role for policy measures and extension in supporting change. For example, for simple changes, there is very limited role for policy and for extension. Whereas if farmers are facing a tactical or strategic or complex change, then there's a greater role for policy to support that change and for extension to facilitate change. The typology can be used to identify the scope for further adoption of a practice. And finally, the typology can be applied to any farm technology, technique, process, or practice. Thank you for listening. Thanks, Myrna.
Thank you so much, Jeff. I'm just going to share Adrian's email in case they would like to send your questions to us. This is the Adrian Sheridan email, sheridan@landcareresearch.co.nz. You can send your questions and then we'll aim to answer and get back to you shortly with the slides as well and the recordings. Thank you very much for your time, and I hope to see you very soon.